The sound of my own life hitting the polished hardwood floor of my daughter's hallway was not a crash, but a series of dull, rhythmic thuds that echoed like the closing of a coffin lid. It was the sound of fabric muffled by gravity and the sharp, plastic clatter of medicine bottles dancing across the floorboards. In that singular, freezing moment of a Tuesday afternoon, the air in the small cottage became thin and brittle, and I realized with a devastating clarity that the son I had nurtured with a lifetime of devotion had finally completed his long, calculated transformation into a stranger. My name is Eleanor Vance, and at 78 years old, I had come to believe that the world was a place of predictable tides and honorable returns. I had spent 42 years as the head archivist in Cannon Beach, Oregon, a coastal town where the Pacific Ocean churns with a relentless, gray energy. My life was defined by the meticulous preservation of history, the sorting of fragile documents, and the belief that if you cared for something properly, it would endure the passage of time. My husband, Elias, had been a man of the earth, a structural engineer who believed in foundations. Together, we had built the Gables, a sprawling Victorian lady of a house that sat atop a rugged cliff overlooking the misty expanse of the ocean. When Elias passed away 9 years ago, he left me with a fortress of security, a paid-off mortgage, a substantial life insurance policy, and an investment portfolio that was supposed to be my silent partner in old age. I was a woman of means, not wealth, but I possessed the kind of stability that allows one to look at the horizon without fear. I had 3 children, and like any mother, I viewed them through a prism of hope that often distorted the reality of their shadows. Julian, my eldest, was a reflection of his father's precision. He was a high-level corporate strategist in San Francisco, a man whose life was measured in billable hours and global acquisitions. He was distant, his affection delivered in the form of high-end gift baskets and brief, efficient phone calls that always started with a glance at his watch. He was a pillar, yes, but a pillar made of cold, unyielding marble. Claire, my middle child, was the heart of the family. She owned a small, struggling floral shop in our village and lived in a cottage that smelled of damp earth and lavender. She was the one who noticed the tremor in my hand before I did. She was the one who came over every Sunday to weed the garden, never asking for a penny, even when the local economy faltered and her shop barely broke even. She was the quiet strength that I often took for granted because she made herself so easy to overlook. And then there was Leo, my youngest, my golden boy. If Julian was marble and Claire was earth, Leo was water. He was fluid, brilliant, and utterly incapable of holding a shape. He possessed a charm that could bypass any defense, a smile that seemed to promise that everything would be all right even as the walls were crumbling. For years, I had been the architect of his survival. When his boutique marketing firm in Portland collapsed, I paid the lease. When his marriage to a kind, sensible girl ended in a messy divorce, I provided the settlement. When he met Vanessa, a woman with a predatory elegance and eyes that never quite smiled, I ignored the warnings from Julian and the worried glances from Claire. I told myself that Leo was a late bloomer, a sensitive soul who simply hadn't found his footing in a harsh world. I loved him with a desperate, enabling ferocity, fearing that if I ever stopped holding him up, he would vanish into the abyss of his own failures. The beginning of the end arrived 18 months ago in the form of a subtle, persistent shaking in my right hand. It started while I was pouring tea, a tiny, rebellious vibration that caused the silver spoon to chatter against the porcelain cup. The diagnosis of a progressive neurological condition was delivered with a kind of clinical gentleness by a doctor who looked too young to be talking about the end of a life's autonomy. He spoke of dopamine levels, physical therapy, and a slow, manageable decline. But to my children, the word disease sounded like a starting gun. Leo and Vanessa, who had been ghosts in my life for nearly a year, suddenly became permanent fixtures at the Gables. They moved with a newfound urgency. Their voices dropped to a conspiratorial whisper whenever I entered a room. Leo started taking over the management of the house, claiming he wanted to spare me the stress. He moved the heavy filing cabinets from my study. He changed the passwords on my computer. He started intercepting the mail, saying that the bills were too confusing for me to handle in my current state. It was a slow, methodical erasure. He began to use the language of concern as a weapon of isolation. If I wanted to drive to the grocery store, he would gently take the keys from my hand, murmuring that my reflexes weren't what they used to be. If Claire called to invite me for lunch, Leo would often answer the phone, telling her I was napping or having a particularly difficult day with my tremors. He was building a wall around me, brick by loving brick, and I was so grateful for the attention that I didn't realize I was being entombed. Vanessa was the whisper in his ear. She would sit in the living room, her fingers tracing the velvet upholstery of my grandmother's chairs, talking about the rising property taxes and the danger of an elderly woman living in such a large, isolated house. She spoke of modern facilities with 24-hour care, places where I wouldn't be a burden to anyone. They were gaslighting me, making me doubt my own stability, my own memory. I would find things misplaced, my glasses in the refrigerator, my checkbook in the laundry room, and Leo would sigh with a performative sadness, shaking his head as if to say, "See, Mom? You can't manage anymore." I know now that he was the one who put them there. The climax of their deception arrived on a rainy Tuesday. Leo came to me with a look of profound anxiety. He explained that a legal crisis involving Vanessa's family estate in Seattle required their immediate presence for at least 10 days. He said he couldn't bear the thought of me being alone at the Gables while they were gone. He suggested I stay with Claire. "It's only for a week, Mom," he had said, his voice dripping with a simulated warmth. "You'll be safe there. Claire has been missing you. I've already packed your things to save you the trouble." I felt a surge of relief at the thought of seeing Claire, of escaping the suffocating atmosphere of the Gables. I didn't question why the suitcase he had packed was the largest one I owned. I didn't wonder why he had cleared out my entire medicine cabinet. I simply let him lead me to the car, believing that this was a temporary bridge, not a final crossing. When we arrived at Claire's, the air felt different. It was humid and smelled of rain-soaked roses. Claire was confused but welcoming, her brow furrowed as she watched Leo unload the heavy bag. I hugged my son at the door, feeling the expensive wool of his coat against my cheek. "Rest well, Mom," he whispered. "Don't worry about the house. I've got everything under control." For 3 days, the world regained its color. Claire and I worked in her greenhouse, the humid warmth soothing the ache in my joints. We sat on her porch and watched the fog roll in over the dunes. I told her about the things I had misplaced, the confusion I had been feeling, and Claire listened with a growing, sharp-eyed suspicion. "Mom," she said on the second night, "you're not confused. You're being managed." The realization began to take root, but I wasn't ready to accept the sheer scale of the betrayal until the 4th afternoon. A black SUV screeched to a halt in Claire's driveway, the engine growling like an angry beast. Leo and Vanessa stepped out. There was no warmth in their movements, no pretense of concern. Leo walked to the trunk, hauled out a second, smaller suitcase, and marched toward the front door. When Claire opened it, she didn't even have a chance to speak. Leo stepped into the small hallway, his face a mask of cold, bureaucratic efficiency. He didn't look at me. He looked through me, as if I were a piece of furniture that had been moved to a more convenient location. "You seem to be doing great here," Leo said, his voice devoid of its usual melodic charm. "Claire knows your routine now. We've decided that it's simply not feasible for you to return to the Gables. The house is far too much for you, and honestly, we need the space to settle our own affairs. We've redirected your mail and moved your essential belongings. You'll be much happier here." With a sharp, dismissive movement, he dropped the suitcase. The latch, which had been poorly secured, popped open. The bag hit the floor with a violent thud, and my life began to spill across Claire's hallway. My favorite silk blouse, a gift from Elias for our 40th anniversary, slid out like a wounded bird. My journals, containing 40 years of private thoughts, tumbled into a heap. My pill bottles, dozens of them, scattered like hailstones, rolling under the shoes of the son I had given everything to. Vanessa stood behind him, adjusting her pearl earrings, her gaze scanning Claire's modest hallway with a look of profound distaste. "It's for the best, Eleanor," she said, her voice like a razor hidden in velvet. "We've already contacted the real estate agent to discuss the valuation of the gables. We need to consolidate the estate to ensure there's enough for your future care, of course." The words real estate agent hit me like a physical blow. They weren't just moving me, they were liquidating me. They were selling the foundation of my life while the body was still warm. I stood there, my right hand shaking uncontrollably, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I wanted to scream, to lash out, to demand that they respect the woman who had birthed them. But the shock had paralyzed my throat. I watched as they turned their backs, walked down the steps, and climbed into the SUV. Leo didn't even look back as he reversed out of the driveway, the tires throwing gravel against Claire's picket fence. The silence that followed was suffocating. Claire dropped to her knees, her hands trembling as she began to gather my scattered pills. "Oh, Mom," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Oh, Mom, I'm so sorry." I didn't cry. The pain was too vast for tears, a cold, crystalline anger that seemed to bypass my failing nerves and settle deep in my marrow. I looked at the mess on the floor and saw not just clothes and medicine, but the wreckage of a mother's blind faith. I had been returned like an unwanted gift. I had been discarded like a broken tool. That night, sleep was an impossibility. I sat in Claire's small guest room, the darkness pressing in on me, and for the first time in years, I allowed myself to see the truth without the softening filter of maternal love. Leo didn't love me. He loved the security I represented. He didn't see a mother. He saw an asset with an expiration date. And Vanessa was the architect of his greed, the one who had whispered the poison of entitlement into his ear until he believed that my life was merely a hurdle to his own. The next morning, the fog was so thick I couldn't see the ocean. I sat at Claire's kitchen table, my hands steady for a brief, miraculous window of clarity. Claire sat across from me, her eyes red and puffy. "Mom, we can't let them do this," she said. "But the lawyers Leo has, they're expensive. He's already frozen your main accounts, hasn't he?" I looked at her and felt a surge of a different kind of strength, the strength of a woman who had spent 40 years organizing the chaos of history. "I don't need a lawyer yet," I said, my voice low and firm. "I need my eldest son." I called Julian. When he answered his private line in San Francisco, his voice was as sharp as a scalpel. "Yes, Mother? I'm in the middle of a merger. Is this urgent?" I told him. I didn't embellish. I didn't plead. I gave him the facts with the precision of a deposition. I told him about the suitcase. I told him about the real estate agent. I told him about the medication on the floor. There was a silence on the other end of the line that lasted so long I thought the connection had failed. When Julian finally spoke, his voice had changed. The coldness was still there, but it was no longer directed at me. It was the coldness of a predator who had found a more worthy target. "Mother," he said, his words measured and lethal. "I have tolerated Leo's incompetence for years because he was your favorite, and I didn't want to cause you pain. But he has crossed a line that does not exist in my world. He has attempted a hostile takeover of a life that does not belong to him. Do not speak to him. Do not answer the door. I will be in Cannon Beach by sunset." Julian didn't arrive alone. He came with a team that looked like a private army of bureaucrats, 2 forensic accountants, a specialist in elder law, and a man whose only job seemed to be looking intimidating in a dark suit. They didn't go to the Gables first. They set up a command center in Claire's floral shop, surrounded by the scent of lilies and cold earth. For the next week, the air was thick with the sound of tapping keyboards and low-voiced phone calls. Julian treated the situation with the same ruthless efficiency he applied to a failing tech company. He discovered that Leo had already moved nearly $60,000 from my secondary savings account using a forged power of attorney. He found that Vanessa had contacted an auction house to appraise the antique furniture that had been in my family for 3 generations. "They thought you were a ghost," Julian said to me one evening as we sat in the shop, surrounded by buckets of roses. "They thought because your hand shook, your mind had dissolved. They forgot who taught me how to read a contract. They forgot who ran the archives for 4 decades. We didn't strike immediately. Julian wanted them to feel secure. He wanted them to move their own belongings into the Gables. He wanted them to sign the listing agreement with the real estate agent. He wanted the paper trail to be so long and so clear that no judge in the state would be able to ignore it. The day of the reckoning was a Friday, a day of piercing blue skies and a wind that bit through your coat. Leo and Vanessa had been summoned to a meeting at a law office in Astoria, under the pretense of finalizing the estate consolidation they so desperately craved. They arrived looking like the victors of a war they hadn't fought, Leo in a camel hair coat and Vanessa in a designer suit that probably cost more than Claire's monthly rent. When they entered the conference room, the air seemed to leave their lungs. I was sitting at the head of the table, flanked by Julian and the elder law specialist. Claire sat beside me, her hand resting on my shoulder. Leo's face went through a sickening series of changes. Confusion, then a forced, greasy smile, then a flicker of genuine terror. "Mom, what are you doing here? You should be resting." "Julian, what is this?" Julian didn't stand up. He didn't raise his voice. He simply opened a thick black folder and began to read. He read the dates of the forged signatures. He read the transcripts of the phone calls Leo had made to the bank, pretending to be my authorized representative. He read the cease and desist orders that had already been served to the real estate agent and the auction house. Leo tried to bluster. "This is a family matter. Mom isn't well. She's being manipulated by Julian. She has Parkinson's, for God's sake." The lawyer, a woman with iron gray hair and a voice like a gavel, leaned forward. "Mr. Vance, having Parkinson's disease does not strip a woman of her civil rights or her property. However, forging a signature on a federal banking document is a felony, and attempting to coerce an elder into vacating their primary residence under false pretenses is a violation of the Elder Abuse Prevention Act." Vanessa's composure shattered first. She turned on Leo, her voice a shrill, ugly rasp. "You told me she was senile. You told me Julian wouldn't care." Leo looked at me then, his eyes wide and wet, trying to find the golden boy mask that had worked for 35 years. "Mom, please. I was doing it for us. I was trying to make sure we were all taken care of. You know I love you more than they do." I looked at my youngest son, and for the first time in my life, I didn't see a boy who needed my help. I saw a man who had tried to steal my dignity so he could buy a more comfortable life. I saw a man who would have let me rot in a small room as long as the checks cleared. "Leo," I said, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hand. "You didn't love me. You loved the house. You loved the money Elias left for my security. You saw my illness as a window of opportunity rather than a call for compassion. You threw my journals and my medicine on a hallway floor like trash." I pushed a single piece of paper across the table toward him. It was an eviction notice for the Gables, effective in 48 hours. It was also a formal notification that his name had been removed from every trust, every account, and every iteration of my will. "You have 2 days to remove your things from my house," I said. "If you take so much as a silver spoon that doesn't belong to you, Julian has the police on standby. You are no longer a part of my estate, and you are no longer a part of my life." The shouting that followed was ugly and desperate. Leo raged, Vanessa cried, and they both hurled insults that would have broken me a month ago. But as I sat there, I felt a strange, quiet peace. The sound of their anger was nothing compared to the sound of that suitcase hitting the floor. The worst had already happened, and I had survived it. In the weeks that followed, the house was cleared. It was a painful process, walking through the rooms and seeing where they had tried to erase me. There were wine stains on the carpets and scratches on the mahogany desk. But with Claire's help, we restored it. We didn't do it so I could live there alone, however. The Gables was too large, and the climb to the cliffs was becoming too steep for my unsteady legs. Julian, in a rare moment of genuine vulnerability, admitted that he couldn't be there as often as I needed. Claire admitted that her shop was failing because she spent all her time worrying about me. So, we made a decision not as a victim and her keepers, but as a family of equals. We sold the Gables, not in a panicked fire sale, but with the care it deserved. The proceeds were split. A large portion went into a trust for my care, but a significant amount was used to buy a beautiful, modern duplex in a garden community just blocks away from Claire's shop. Claire and her family live in one half. I live in the other. I have my own kitchen, my own library, and a garden that Claire and I tend together. Julian still calls every Sunday, but now the calls are longer. He doesn't look at his watch as much. He realized that his distance had created the vacuum that Leo tried to fill with malice, and he is trying, in his own marble-pillared way, to melt a little. Leo hasn't contacted us since that day in Astoria. We heard through the grapevine that he and Vanessa are living in a small apartment in a different state, still chasing the next big score, still blaming everyone else for their failures. I don't wish them ill, but I no longer wish them well. They are simply ghosts of a mistake I finally stopped making. I have learned that the sunset of a life is not a time for surrender, but a time for a different kind of courage. My hand still shakes. Some days, the tremors are so bad I can't hold a pen. But my mind is my own, and my dignity is intact. I have learned that love without boundaries is a dangerous thing. It is a slow-acting poison that masquerades as kindness. By constantly rescuing Leo, I had denied him the chance to become a man of character, and I had nearly allowed him to destroy the woman who had given him life. The greatest inheritance a mother can leave her children is not a house or a bank account. It is the example of a life lived with self-respect. It is the lesson that loyalty must be earned, and that even the deepest love must have a perimeter that no one is allowed to breach. Tonight, the wind is howling off the Pacific, and the rain is drumming against the windows of my new home. I am sitting in my favorite chair, a cup of tea in my steady hand, watching Claire through the glass door as she moves through her own living room. I am safe. I am respected. I am Eleanor Vance, and I have finally learned that while my body may be failing, my soul is a fortress that I alone command. The suitcase in the hallway was not the end of my story. It was the prologue to my liberation. It was the moment I realized that I didn't need to be lucky to be a mother. I needed to be strong. And in the quiet, golden light of this new chapter, I have finally found the strength to be exactly who I was always meant to be. A woman who knows her worth. A woman who has reclaimed her name. And a woman who will never again be treated like unwanted furniture. The legacy of the Vances is no longer one of betrayal and greed. It is a legacy of resilience, of a brother and sister who found each other again in the face of a common enemy, and of a mother who refused to go quietly into the night. We are the architects of our own peace, and as the waves continue their eternal rhythm against the Oregon shore, I realize that the most beautiful thing about the tide is not just that it goes out, but that it always, inevitably, finds its way back home. Dignity, I have realized, is a quiet thing. It doesn't shout or pound the table. It simply stands its ground and waits for the truth to catch up. And now, at 78 years old, I can finally say that the truth has arrived, and it is more beautiful than I ever dared to hope. My hand may shake, but my heart is steady, and for the first time in a very long time, the house I live in is built on a foundation that will never, ever give way.